Hello everyone and welcome to another DecodeChess video. I'm Grandmaster Benjamin Bok and it's my pleasure to take you through Game 6 of the World Championship match between World Champion Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. So the game started off with 1d4, knight f6 from Jan, knight f3 by Magnus, d5 and g3. Little move order thing here by Magnus. He wants to go into the Catalan but delay the move c4. Okay, so Jan goes bishop e7, castles. And why did he delay c4? Well, he wanted to play the move b3. Jan goes c5, putting pressure on the center, Magnus takes, and now we see c4. Challenging the pawn on d5, so the bishop on g2 can open up. So Jan took on c4, queen c2 was played by Magnus, queen e7 by Jan. Magnus played knight bd2, knight c6, knight takes c4. Pretty standard opening here, and here Jan finds a really good move to fully equalize. He plays the move b5. Now b5 is a good move because it challenges the knight on c4, it vacates the square on b7 for the bishop. Knight b4 is a potential option later on. So b5 was a great move by Nepo. b5, Magnus goes knight c5, knight b4 by Jan. Queen b2 and bishop b7. So bishop b7 is good because it neutralized the bishop on g2. a3 by Magnus, Jan drops back to c6, knight d3. So Jan goes bishop b6, keeping the bishop on d4 on the board, and he keeps controlling the d4 square. So bishop g5 by Magnus, rook fd8 by Jan. Magnus trades, Jan recaptures with the g-pawn. Interesting decision. I feel like if he was satisfied with a draw, he wanted to take with the queen, but I felt like Jan felt like he could go for more. So he took with the pawn, rook ac1. The knight d4 is a very good move, completely neutralizing the bishop on the long diagonal, and here's where black really solves his problems. He could have also played e5 if he wanted to be a bit more ambitious, to try to go e4 with a pin with a fork on both the knights, but e5 has a drawback that it weakens the f5 square, right? The pawn no longer controls that. So knight d4 by Jan, Magnus trades, Jan recaptures, Magnus goes queen a2, we see a trade on g2, queen b7 check, the king steps back, and queen e4. Another nice move by Jan. Here white's a little bit stuck, he cannot move the f-pawn off the board, he also cannot play e3 because that would hang the knight. So Jan around this point was doing pretty well. Magnus played queen c2, a5, rook f1 by Magnus, king g7, rook d2, and here risky decision by Jan. He plays rook ac8, which allows Magnus to sacrifice the queen for the two rooks. Magnus also kind of had to. If he would have gone queen d1, that would have been very passive, as well, let's say bishop c3, and black is a good position. So that's why Magnus took. And here's where the game became quite wild. Jan took and played queen to d5, hitting the pawn on b3. So Magnus played b4 and a4, fixing the weakness on a3. So Magnus goes e3, bishop e5 by Jan, h4 by Magnus, and Jan goes h5, making sure that his king cannot get completely boxed in. King h2 by Magnus, and Jan plays bishop b2. Now here Magnus has an interesting decision to make. If he takes on b2, Jan would take on d3, and this would likely just lead to a draws position if Magnus can just play rook a2, and the position is approximately even. Right, a3 is defended, but neither side can really make progress. So Magnus goes rook to c5, Jan goes queen to d6, and here Magnus makes a big mistake. Once again, he could have taken on a2, Jan takes on b3, and after rook a2, the position should just be equal, because neither side can really make progress. But instead of that, Magnus plays the move rook to d1. This allows Jan to take on a3, Magnus takes on b5, and Jan goes queen d7. Now the problem for white is here that the rook doesn't have a good square to go to, because if the rook goes here, black has queen c7, attacking the rook, and if the rook moves, there's queen c2, attacking the knight and the rook. So Magnus played rook to c5, Jan plays e5, an excellent move. It's guarding the f4 square from the knight, so the h5 pawn is no longer under attack. He wants to play e4. So Magnus goes rook to c2, and here's where Jan misses a really big opportunity. Maybe this could have changed the outcome of the match, right? Because here Jan could have just taken on b4, which would have been an excellent move. He takes a pawn, it stops rook cd2 and rook dd2. The knight still cannot recapture because that would hang the rook on d1. mean, white has an X-ray here, but it's also a pin. Now after bishop takes b4, white could have played rook cc1, but Jan would have had bishop a3, attacking the rook. And if the rook goes here, a very nice move, queen to g4. Now white cannot take here because then the rook hangs. So Jan would have been winning here, but this was very difficult to see. Both players were in time pressure, and Jan misses his chance. He plays queen to d5. Magnus goes rook dd2, Jan goes queen b3, rook a2, and here e4, which is a mistake. It would have been better to play, I believe, something like f5. e4, knight c5, Jan takes on b4. Here Magnus misses a chance. He should have played rook dc2. The point being is that black's pieces are kind of stuck. You can't really move any of those. And if white gets another move, let's say after f5, he can take on a4 and go rook c3. And now you get the bishop. And here we get an endgame where black is the queen and white is the two rooks, but black's pawns are kind of weak. So white has good chances still to win here. So Magnus takes on e4 in the 40th move. Once again, both players were in time pressure. Queen b3, an excellent move by Jan. You don't want to go into this endgame, taking on e4, because the pawn on a4 will probably drop off, and then white has good winning chances because black's pawns on the king side are so weak. So queen b3 by Nepo, and around here the game, it feels like it should be a draw, but Magnus keeps on trying. So rook ac2, bishop f8, knight c5. Once again, you don't want to go for the straight because it's likely that your a pawn will just get lost. So Jan goes here, knight d3, a3, knight f4. An excellent maneuver by Magnus. The pawn on h5 is very weak. So Jan goes queen a5, rook a2 and bishop e4, rook d3 and king h6. Rook d1, queen a4, rook da1, bishop d6. So both players are moving around, but it feels like the game is a draw here. King g1, queen b3, knight e2, queen d3, knight d4, king h7, king h2. But here Jan makes a very weird decision. It feels like he should have just kept the position with a move like king g6, for example, and it's very difficult for white to make any progress. But instead he played the move queen e4, and this allows Magnus opportunity. Magnus takes on a3. Now Jan could have taken the rook on a3, but this position is rather unpleasant, because white can always maneuver around. Like white can put the rook on f4, for example, maybe maneuver the knight to f4 and the rook to a5, then the pawn on h5 will start hanging. So it feels like because all of these weaknesses on the king side for black, Magnus can try to pick up those pawns one by one. So instead, Jan plays queen takes h4. Magnus goes king to g1, and Jan goes queen e4. Now if Jan gets another move, well, first of all, this rook is under attack. He could not take the rook here, because then the queen could be taken. But if Jan gets another move, he wants to go h4 and soften up the white pawns on the king side. So rook a4 is played by Magnus, bishop e5 and knight e2, stopping h4. So Jan goes queen c2, rook a2 and queen b3. He wants to try to tie the rooks to a defensive square. So king g2 by Magnus, queen d5 and f3, queen d1, f4, bishop c7 and king f2. Now white is nicely defending everything, but it's difficult to make progress. Bishop e6, but here Magnus starts some excellent maneuvering. So rook a1, queen b3, he goes for rook to e4. He wants to send both rooks to the 8th rank and then start creating threats against the black king. So king g7, rook e8 and f5, making a bit more space for the king. Rook a8, queen b4, rook ac8, bishop a5. Rook c1 was played because queen e1 was a threat. Rook c1, bishop e6, and Magnus goes rook e5, attacking the pawn on f5. So Jan goes queen b3, keeping an eye on the pawn on b3 with the bishop and the queen. So Magnus goes rook e8, queen d5, and rook c8. He's going to try to create threats against the black king. But now Jan goes queen h1. He wants to give a couple checks here, so Magnus plays rook c1, the only move to keep the game going. Now you can give a check, but then after queen f3, king f3, the queen is kind of stuck. So Jan goes back to d5. Rook b1 is played by Magnus, bishop a7, rook e7, a good move, hitting the bishop. Bishop c5, rook e5, queen d3, rook b7, queen c2, and rook b5, attacking the bishop on c5. So the players repeat the position here once, and Magnus finally takes on c5. But here Jan has the move queen d3, attacking the pawn on e3, and if you defend with this rook, there's bishop takes c3. If you recapture, this rook is hanging, and it's a draw. And the same goes if you defend with this rook, then once again bishop takes c3 will be played. And then you take here. with the draw. But Magnus has other ideas. He goes for rook takes f7, king takes on rook b7, and now the game reaches another stage where white has a rook, a knight, and 2 pawns versus a queen. But it feels like it's very difficult for Magnus to make progress. So Jan does a good job of blocking the e4 push. He goes king back. He keeps waiting, and he goes there. Now he goes queen b1 to start checking. So he gives a check and goes back. So again, it's important to put the queen here to stop e4. So Magnus goes here. He goes here, pinning the pawn. Rook c2, queen b1, knight at d4, queen h1, a check. Okay, so the players are doing a lot of maneuvering here, but it feels like Magnus cannot make any progress. But he keeps trying. He goes for knight g1, an interesting move. He wants to put the knight on e2, where it's really defending everything. So queen b4, rook d1, queen b3, check, and rook d4. Okay, so he gets the knight e2. So now the knight on e2 is nicely protecting everything. Queen b1, 4. So queen h1 is played by Nepo, but once again, this knight on g1 is knight on e2 is also defending the pawn on g3. d8, king g8, d4, queen h2. So Jan trades off one pair of pawns, which should be good for him. Right, usually if you're defending, you want to trade off pawns to increase your drawing chances. Rook d3 played by Magnus, an excellent move. He wants to put the rook on e3 and go for that setup. So king f8, rook f3, queen d8, king e3, and here I use deep decode because this is really the moment where Jan, I mean, it's too early to say that he made a decisive mistake, but after this I think the game becomes impossible to hold, practically speaking. In this position, Jan should have played queen at b6, and the idea behind that move is that it forces white to block with knight at d4, but the setup that Magnus wanted was to have the knight on g3 and then the king around those squares, because the knight on g3 does a really good job of blocking a lot of checks, and he sort of creates a little box for himself there where it's almost impossible for black to give checks. So I think queen b6, if Jan would have played that move, he would have probably still drawn the game, but after he allowed queen a5 and king f2, the game became very difficult to hold. So queen b6 was a good move, and let's see why with deep decode. So queen a5, which was the move that Jan played, does not stop king f2 and the king to g2. And the king wants to go to f2 because it vacates the e3 square for the rook. So, and we saw in the game why that was so important. So to queen a5, king f2, queen a7, rook e3, queen a7, knight g3, queen e2, king f3. So Magnus gets this ideal setup. Right, rook to e2. The king always sits pretty safe on g4. There's not a lot of checks for black. Queen b3, king g2, queen b7, and rook d2. Another excellent maneuver by Magnus. He wants to send the rook to the 5th rank. It checks the king, and once again it sort of creates this little box for the white king in which it cannot be checked. So rook e5, another check, and e5. Notice how everything is nicely protected. So queen e2, king h3, queen e6, king h4, queen h6, and knight h5. He's slowly but surely pushing up the board. Queen h7, e6, an excellent move. The rook cannot be taken, do the knight g7 check, and you win the queen. And after queen g6, Magnus stays very accurate. He plays rook to f7. This looks like a mistake because of queen takes e6, but guess what? After check, takes, and king g5, the last important move, this pawn in game is winning. If black goes here, we go king f5, and wherever the king goes, if here we go king e6, and if king e7, king g6, and this pawn will just march forward. So after rook f7, Jan played king to d8, f5 by Magnus, queen g1, and now a very elegant finishing move, knight to g7, and the game is over. e7, e8 cannot be stopped, and if black gives a couple checks along the g and h files, white just steps up the board, and he can very nicely hide on the g8 square. Once again, this knight really did an excellent job of blocking all the checks from black. So an amazing game by Magnus. He wins the 6th game and takes the lead in the match. I hope you all enjoyed the video. So this is how you can use DecodeChess to analyze very complicated games. You can also use it to analyze your own games. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next video.